I didn't think much of the job when I first applied. It was a listing buried on a classifieds website. Night security needed at Hargrave Museum of Art. 20-hour. No prior experience required. The words, "no prior experience," jumped out like a beacon. I'd been out of work for months, the kind of dry spell that gnaws at your pride and keeps your phone silent. The bills weren't waiting, and I was desperate. When I arrived for the interview, the place loomed over me like some kind of Gothic beast. The Hargrave Museum wasn't a sleek, modern gallery. It was an ancient, towering structure with gargoyles perched on its edges and ivy clawing at its brick walls. It looked more like a place where ghosts would gather than art enthusiasts. The inside wasn't much better. High ceilings, marble floors, and paintings that seemed too real stared back at me as I walked toward the main desk. The air smelled faintly of varnish and old books, like it had been sealed off from the world for decades. "Mr. Graham?" a voice called. I turned to see a man standing in the dimly lit corridor. He looked to be in his 70s, though his posture was ramrod straight. His suit was immaculate, but his face was worn, as if he'd been carved out of stone and left to weather for too long. "I'm Wells," he said, "the supervisor. Follow me." He didn't wait for a response. His footsteps echoed as he led me deeper into the museum. We passed room after room of exhibits, paintings, sculptures, artifacts. Some pieces were beautiful, but others gave me the creeps. There was a statue of a woman draped in black, her face obscured, that made my stomach churn for reasons I couldn't explain. Finally, we reached a small office tucked away near the back. Wells handed me a clipboard with a single sheet of paper. "These are the rules. Read them carefully." The list was short but strange. "Do not look directly at the painting in the east wing after AM if you hear footsteps. Do not turn around. Never leave the main hallways after midnight. If the lights flicker, remain still until they stabilize." I looked up, half expecting Wells to crack a smile, but his expression was grave. "You're serious?" I asked, trying to suppress a chuckle. "Deadly serious," he replied without hesitation. "Break a rule, and it's your life on the line. Is this some kind of hazing ritual? Scare the new guy?" Wells sighed, his patience clearly thinning. "You think I care enough to play games? This isn't a joke, Mr. Graham. Do your job, follow the rules, and you'll be fine." Something in his tone silenced my protests. I nodded, tucking the clipboard under my arm. "Good," he said. "Your shift starts at PM and ends at AM. The cameras are in the security room down the hall. You'll patrol the main floors once an hour. The rest of the time, stay in the security room." Simple enough? "Yeah, I got it. Don't get curious," he added, his eyes narrowing. "Curiosity gets people killed here." With that, he left, his footsteps fading into the vast emptiness of the museum. My first night felt uneventful at first. The museum, bathed in shadows, was eerily quiet. The sound of my boots against the marble floor seemed deafening, and I found myself walking on my toes to avoid disturbing the stillness. The exhibits took on a different aura in the dark. Paintings that looked serene in daylight seemed to shift their moods under the faint glow of emergency lights. Sculptures cast twisted shadows that danced on the walls, making the space feel alive in ways it shouldn't. I spent most of the night in the security room, a small, claustrophobic space filled with monitors showing grainy footage of the museum. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At midnight, I began my second patrol. The halls stretched endlessly, each turn revealing more of the museum's strange collection. Around AM, I found myself in the East Wing, staring at the painting mentioned in the rules. It was large, almost floor-to-ceiling, and depicted a man in period clothing, standing in a forest. His face was pale, almost waxy, And his eyes. God, his eyes. They were so lifelike, it felt like they were boring into me. I took a step back, my skin crawling. Don't look at it after AM. I muttered to myself, trying to laugh off the unease. Back in the security room, I settled into the uncomfortable chair, sipping a lukewarm coffee I'd brought from home. Hours passed. The cameras showed nothing but stillness, but my nerves were fraying. Every creak of the building, every distant hum of machinery felt like a threat. At exactly AM, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, a soft tap, tap, tap echoing down the corridor outside the security room. My breath hitched. Wells's voice rang in my head. If you hear footsteps, do not turn around. The sound grew louder, closer. I gripped the edge of the desk, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I stared at the monitors, praying to see anyone on the cameras. But there was nothing. Then the door handle began to turn. The door didn't open. I stared, paralyzed, as the handle jiggled slightly, then stopped. My chest felt tight, each breath a struggle. The security monitors showed nothing in the hallway outside, just the dim, empty corridor stretching into darkness. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. The air felt heavier with each tick, but nothing else happened. Slowly, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe it's just the building settling, I told myself. Old places like this made noises, pipes groaned, wood shifted, air vents clicked. That had to be it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. Not just now, but since I'd arrived. The silence wasn't empty. It had weight, like the museum itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something wrong. The rest of the night dragged on. I patrolled the halls, following Wells's instructions to the letter. Each step echoed in the cavernous rooms, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. Around AM, I returned to the East Wing. The painting, the one with the pale man in the forest, seemed different, though I couldn't put my finger on why. His eyes still had that unnerving quality, like they were tracking my every move. But there was something else. The shadows around him looked darker, as if the forest behind him had deepened overnight. I shuddered and forced myself to look away. Whatever unease I felt, staring at it wouldn't help. When my shift ended at AM, Wells was waiting in the lobby. He stood by the front desk, hands clasped behind his back, as if he'd been there 4 hours. "How was your first night?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Quiet," I said finally. "No real issues." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Follow the rules, and it'll stay that way." I wanted to ask him about the footsteps, about the painting, about the suffocating sense of dread that seemed baked into the museum's walls. But something in his tone warned me not to. "See you tonight," he said, turning away. That day, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the museum. The East Wing. The man in the painting. I kept replaying the moment when the door handle turned, searching for some logical explanation. Maybe someone had been messing with me, a prank by Wells, or maybe another employee I hadn't met yet. By the time my second shift rolled around, I was running on fumes. I showed up a few minutes early, hoping to catch Wells and press him for more details, but he was nowhere to be seen. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Midnight came and went, and I started my second patrol. The museum felt colder tonight, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. When I reached the East Wing, I stopped in my tracks. The painting had changed. It wasn't a big difference, just enough to make my skin crawl. The man's head was tilted slightly to the left, and his lips, which had been neutral the night before, were now curled into the faintest hint of a smile. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. No, that's not possible. I took out my phone and snapped a picture. The flash illuminated the room for a brief second, and I winced at the brightness. Looking at the photo, the painting seemed normal. No smile, no head tilt. Just the same eerie stare as before. The relief was short-lived. As I put my phone away, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were distant at first, coming from somewhere deeper in the museum. My throat tightened as I remembered the rule. If you hear footsteps, do not turn around. I stood perfectly still, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't just my imagination. The sound echoed through the east wing, bouncing off the marble floors and vaulted ceilings. I clenched my fists, willing myself not to move. Don't turn around. Don't turn around. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, I felt it something behind me. The hair on my neck stood on end, and my chest tightened as if an invisible weight had settled on me. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting under my breath. 1, 2, 3. The feeling didn't go away. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't risk breaking the rule. Instead, I forced myself to walk, one slow step at a time, back toward the main hallway. The sensation of being watched didn't fade until I reached the security room. I slammed the door behind me, locking it out of habit. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Back at the monitors, everything seemed normal again. The hallways were empty, the exhibits undisturbed. I sat there, trying to calm myself, when something caught my eye. The camera for the east wing flickered. Just for a second. When the feed returned, the pale man in the painting was looking directly at the lens. The third night felt different from the moment I stepped through the doors. The museum seemed to hum with a low energy, like a deep vibration I couldn't quite hear, but could feel in my chest. The air carried a strange heaviness, as though the building itself resented my presence. Wells wasn't at the front desk this time. The absence of his imposing figure left me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. There was something unsettling about him, but his presence had been oddly reassuring, a human constant in a place that felt anything but. I signed in and headed for the security room. As the heavy door clicked shut behind me, I reviewed the night's instructions again, even though I knew them by heart. The list was brief, but every word seemed to carry a weight it hadn't before. The first 2 hours passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. It wasn't like the first night, where the sensation had come and gone in fleeting moments. This was constant, an unrelenting awareness of something unseen hovering just beyond the edge of perception. When I reached the east wing, I hesitated. The pale man's painting loomed at the end of the corridor, its frame gleaming faintly under the overhead lights. His gaze was as piercing as ever, but I noticed a new detail. The shadows behind him had thickened, growing darker and more intricate, as though the forest were alive, expanding into some unknowable depth. I forced myself to keep walking. Staring too long at that painting felt like inviting trouble, though I couldn't explain why. It was near AM when I heard the sound again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the museum. My blood ran cold. Not again. This time, they weren't distant. They were close, much closer than before. My hands clenched into fists as the rule echoed in my mind. If you hear footsteps, do not turn around. I froze in place, every muscle tensed. The sound grew louder, each step deliberate, calculated. They stopped just behind me. The air felt electric, charged with something I couldn't name. My instincts screamed at me to bolt, but my rational mind knew better. Whatever was there, It wasn't something I could outrun. I tried to keep my breathing steady. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I was sure it would give me away. Then, without warning, a whisper cut through the silence. "Why are you here?" The voice was low and rasping, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. My stomach turned. I wanted to scream, to whirl around and confront whatever was behind me, but the rule held me in place. "I'm just doing my job," I whispered, my voice trembling. The silence stretched on, oppressive and smothering. Then the footsteps resumed, retreating this time, fading into the distance. I didn't move until I was sure I was alone. When I finally turned, the hallway was empty. My legs felt like jelly as I made my way back to the security room, where I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. The monitors were static-free, showing the same empty hallways and galleries as before. But when I checked the feed for the East Wing, my breath caught. The painting of the pale man had changed again. His smile was wider now, his teeth just visible beneath his lips. The shadows behind him had grown, spilling out of the frame like creeping vines. And then, just as I was about to look away, he moved. It was subtle, barely perceptible. His head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing as though he were sizing me up. My hand shot out to turn off the monitor, but before I could, the screen flickered and went black. I sat in the dark for a long time, my mind racing. My logical brain scrambled for answers, faulty wiring, a trick of the light, my own exhaustion playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal. I considered leaving, just walking out and never coming back. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was fear of what might happen if I broke my contract. Wells's cryptic warnings echoed in my mind. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine. But what if the rules weren't enough? The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia. Every creak of the building made me jump, and every shadow felt like it was watching me. When the clock finally struck a.m., I practically sprinted out of the museum. Wells was waiting for me outside, leaning against his car with a cigarette dangling from his lips. His eyes narrowed as he took me in. "You look like hell," he said. "Something's wrong in there," I blurted. The footsteps, the painting, Wells raised a hand, cutting me off. "Don't talk about it." "Not here," his tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. He took a long drag on his cigarette before exhaling slowly. "You're still alive. That means you followed the rules. Keep doing that, and you'll be fine." His words did little to reassure me. The fourth night greeted me with a gnawing sense of inevitability, as though I were stepping into a story already written. The museum loomed larger than before, its walls seeming to lean inward as I approached. A pale fog clung to the ground outside, curling around my ankles as I crossed the threshold. Wells was absent again, and the silence in the lobby was deafening. Even the usual hum of the air conditioning was muted, leaving only the sound of my shoes against the polished floor. I paused by the desk, glancing at the guest sign-in sheet. It was blank as always, but tonight the emptiness felt deliberate, like a warning I couldn't decipher. The rules weighed heavier tonight, their implications sinking into my bones. I went through my initial rounds mechanically, my flashlight casting long shadows that flickered and danced like mocking phantoms. The paintings, sculptures, and artifacts seemed to watch me more intently than before, their presence growing oppressive. When I reached the West Wing, my routine was interrupted by something out of place, a door I didn't recognize. It was old, far older than the rest of the museum's sleek architecture, with a weathered wooden frame and a tarnished brass handle. There was no mention of this door in the layout Wells had given me, nor had I noticed it on any of the monitors. My instinct screamed at me to walk away, but curiosity tethered me in place. I approached cautiously, running my fingers over the rough wood. A faint, rhythmic sound emanated from within, like a heartbeat muffled by thick walls. The rule about locked doors echoed in my mind. Do not attempt to open any locked doors. But when I tried the handle, it turned easily, as though inviting me in. The room beyond was unlike anything I'd seen in the museum. It was circular, its walls lined with shelves that stretched impossibly high, filled with books whose spines were blank. A single pedestal stood at the center, illuminated by a shaft of pale light that had no discernible source. On the pedestal lay an object shrouded in a black cloth. I hesitated, every nerve screaming that I didn't belong here. But the pull was too strong. I approached the pedestal, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cloth shifted as though stirred by an unseen breeze, revealing the edge of something metallic. When I finally lifted the fabric, I found a mirror. Its surface was smooth and dark, reflecting nothing but an empty void. As I stared, the mirror seemed to come alive, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Shapes began to form indistinct at first, but growing sharper with each passing second. I saw myself, standing in the room, but the reflection wasn't quite right. My movements were slow or delayed, like watching an old film reel with a broken frame rate. And then the reflection smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was sharp, predatory, stretching far beyond the limits of normalcy. My stomach churned as the reflection raised a hand and beckoned. I stumbled backward, the mirror's surface going dark once more. The heartbeat-like sound grew louder, echoing in my skull, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee. The door slammed shut behind me as I bolted, leaving the strange room and its sinister contents behind. Back in the West Wing, I struggled to catch my breath. The artifacts lining the walls seemed to lean closer, their forms distorted by my flashlight's beam. My radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Why did you go there?" The voice wasn't Wells's. It was deep, gravelly, and utterly inhuman. My blood turned to ice as the radio cut out, leaving only static. I dropped the device, letting it clatter to the floor, and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the security room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. The monitors offered no comfort. The hallways appeared empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond the camera's reach. I avoided looking at the East Wing feed, but my eyes were drawn there regardless. The pale man's painting was waiting, his grin now a full, jagged smile. The forest behind him had consumed the entire background, leaving no trace of the original scene. And then the monitor flickered. For a brief moment, I saw the room with the pedestal. The mirror was there, but the black cloth had fallen away completely. A figure stood before it, facing the camera. It was me or something wearing my face. The screen went blank again, and I sat frozen, my mind racing. The rules hadn't prepared me for this. Wells's vague warnings felt insufficient now, laughable even. When AM finally arrived, I didn't wait to see if Wells was outside. I left the museum without looking back, the cold morning air a relief against my burning lungs. As I drove home, one thought repeated in my mind, over and over: what happens when the rules stop working? I returned the following night with a resolve I didn't recognize in myself. The fear that had chased me out of the museum the day before had dulled into something colder, an intense curiosity, wrapped in a thread of dread. The rules Wells had left were now meaningless to me, flimsy barriers against something far larger than a list of do's and don'ts could contain. The lobby was darker than usual, the overhead lights casting weaker halos that barely reached the tiled floor. A peculiar scent hung in the air, metallic and faintly sweet, like rust and overripe fruit. My footsteps seemed to echo longer than they should have, fading into corners I couldn't see. Wells wasn't there again, though a note rested on the counter. The handwriting was uneven, almost shaky. "Don't go near the East Wing tonight. Stay out of the exhibit halls. No matter what you hear." I crumpled the note without reading it twice. Wells was playing games, or worse. He was just as lost in this as I was. Either way, I had no intention of avoiding the East Wing. Not after what I'd seen on the monitors. The air in the museum was heavier than before, like the entire building was holding its breath. The halls stretched longer, their ends veiled in shadows that seemed to move just out of reach. My flashlight beam struggled to pierce the dark, the batteries inexplicably dim despite being fresh. When I reached the East Wing, the pale man's painting greeted me like an old adversary. His grin was wider now, the teeth sharper and uneven. The background forest had become a full, impenetrable thicket. For the first time, I noticed a hand small and pale emerging from the trees, as though reaching for salvation. The radio crackled on my belt, startling me. "Why did you come back?" It was the same voice from the night before, its tone dripping with malice. "I'm not playing your game," I muttered, yanking the radio off my belt and hurling it down the hallway. It shattered against the tile, the pieces scattering like startled insects. I turned away from the painting and pushed deeper into the East Wing. The exhibits here had always been the most unsettling wax figures that seemed too lifelike, tribal masks with hollow eyes, and taxidermy animals posed in eerie tableau. Tonight, they felt alive. The wax figures' faces seemed to follow me, their eyes reflecting my flashlight's weak beam with a glassy sheen. The masks hung heavier on the walls, their empty stares burrowing into my skin. And the taxidermy animals. They weren't in the same positions as before. Halfway down the corridor, a sound stopped me cold. It was faint at first, a whisper carried on the stale air. But it grew louder, filling the space with overlapping murmurs in a language I couldn't understand. They came from every direction, surrounding me, closing in. I pressed my back to the wall, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The whispers grew into laughter low, guttural, and wrong. A cold breeze swept past me, though the air had been utterly still moments ago. My flashlight flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness for a heart-stopping second. When it came back on, the exhibits had changed. The wax figures now faced the walls, their heads tilted as though listening. The masks were gone entirely, replaced by bare hooks. The taxidermy animals stood in a perfect line along the corridor, their glass eyes fixed forward. I backed away, my breathing shallow and rapid. My foot caught on something soft, and I stumbled, catching myself against the wall. It was the radio, somehow whole again despite being shattered earlier. It buzzed faintly with static, and then that voice returned, clearer than ever. "Come to the gallery." The static cut off abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. I didn't want to obey, but my feet moved of their own accord. The gallery was at the far end of the East Wing, a cavernous room housing the museum's most prized pieces. When I reached the entrance, the doors were wide open, though they were always locked during my rounds. Beyond them, the room was shrouded in darkness, save for a single spotlight illuminating the center. The pale man's painting stood on an easel beneath the light, though it had never been displayed here before. His grin had stretched beyond the bounds of humanity, splitting his face like a grotesque wound. The hand in the forest was now joined by another, both clawing desperately at the edges of the frame. As I stepped closer, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to emanate from the painting itself, pulling me forward. My flashlight died entirely, leaving only the spotlight's cold glow. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me, something tall and massive, its breath hot against the back of my neck. I turned slowly, the weight of dread almost crushing me. There was nothing there. But when I faced the painting again, the pale man was gone. The forest in the frame now stretched endlessly, its trees twisting and bending as though alive. The hands were still there, but they were no longer reaching outward. They were beckoning. And from somewhere deep within the forest, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at me. The spotlight flickered, and the room plunged into complete darkness. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and then silence. When the lights came back on, the painting was gone. I didn't go back to the break room after what happened in the gallery. Instead, I sat in the lobby, watching the hours drag across the clock. My flashlight was useless now, its batteries drained beyond repair. The museum was silent again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforted. It was charged, humming with an unseen energy, like the quiet before a storm. I tried calling Wells, but my phone had no signal. Even the landline on the counter was dead, its tone replaced by an empty void. I wanted to leave every cell in my body screamed for the safety of the outside world, but something stronger kept me anchored. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was sheer stupidity. At a.m., the lobby lights flickered. A moment later, a soft shuffle came from the hallway leading to the east wing. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, measured footsteps, deliberate and heavy. They echoed off the tiled floor, a rhythmic march that felt impossibly human and entirely wrong. When the figure finally emerged, my breath caught in my throat. It was Wells, but something about him was off. His skin was pallid, stretched too tightly over his bones, and his eyes shone with an unnatural gleam. He moved stiffly, like a puppet on strings, his head jerking slightly with each step. "Why are you here?" His voice was flat, devoid of the usual irritation. "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back, though my voice shook. Wells tilted his head, the motion too sharp, too sudden. "I warned you. I told you not to break the rules. The rules don't make sense." I snapped, rising to my feet. "Why are you hiding things from me? What's really going on in this place?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the counter, his movements eerily precise. He reached into the drawer beneath it and pulled out a thick binder. "This isn't about understanding," he said, placing the binder on the counter with a thud. "It's about survival." The binder was labeled Incident Reports. The edges of the pages were yellowed with age, the text inside written in neat, clinical handwriting. "Every person who's worked this job before you," Wells explained, his tone unnervingly calm, "thought they could outsmart the rules. They thought they could face what's here without following the system." I flipped through the pages, my stomach twisting. Each report detailed events disturbingly similar to my own experiences, paintings that changed, whispers in the dark, shadows that moved when they shouldn't. But it was the final entries that chilled me to the core. Each report ended with the same sentence: employee failed to adhere to protocol. Status: missing. "You let them die," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I kept them alive as long as I could," Wells corrected. "And I'm trying to do the same for you by feeding me cryptic rules and leaving me to figure everything out on my own." I slammed the binder shut, the sound echoing in the empty lobby. Wells leaned in, his face unnervingly close to mine. His breath was ice cold. "You're still here, aren't you?" Before I could respond, the museum's lights dimmed again. The air shifted, thick with an oppressive presence. Wells straightened abruptly, his head jerking toward the east wing. "They're here," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Who?" He didn't answer. Instead, He grabbed my arm with a grip far stronger than I expected and pulled me toward the break room. "We don't have much time," he said. "Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone, no matter what you hear. And you?" I asked, resisting his grip. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "I've already broken too many rules." Wells left, and I was alone again. The break room felt smaller than before, its walls pressing in on me. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging like an eternity. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible over the clock. But they grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of overlapping voices. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside my head. The doorknob rattled, breaking my trance. "Let me in." The voice was familiar. It was Wells. But something about it was wrong, too smooth, too perfect, like a recording played just slightly off pitch. I said, "Don't open the door," Wells had warned. I backed away, my heart pounding. "Please," the voice begged. "It's not safe out here. Let me in." The whispers grew louder, drowning out the clock. The room felt colder, the temperature dropping by the second. My breath formed visible clouds in the air. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. "I'm not going anywhere," the voice said, its tone shifting to something darker, more menacing. "You can't keep me out forever." I clutched a chair, ready to defend myself if the door burst open. The whispers reached a deafening pitch, and for a moment, I thought I would lose my mind. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The room was silent. The doorknob was still. I collapsed into the chair, my body trembling. But before I could catch my breath, the clock on the wall chimed once. It was a.m., and I wasn't alone. The clock's chime echoed in my ears, louder than it had any right to be. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. But then I felt it, a presence behind me, palpable and cold, the kind of sensation that makes your skin crawl before your mind catches up. I turned slowly. The room was empty, or at least it should have been. In the far corner, the shadows seemed thicker, unnaturally so, like a patch of darkness that refused to yield to the dim glow of the overhead light. My breath caught as I realized the shadows were moving, shifting with purpose, creeping toward me like oil spreading across water. "Wells," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I clutched the nearest object, a chair, its weight reassuring but utterly inadequate. The darkness coiled, its tendrils slithering closer, and with each inch it covered, the air grew colder, heavier. "Stop!" I shouted, though it sounded pitiful even to my own ears. The shadows didn't stop. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl, like something primal and hungry. It came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in my chest. The break room wasn't safe. I bolted for the door, flinging it open and stumbling into the hallway. The museum's fluorescent lights flickered wildly, casting the space in disorienting flashes of light and dark. The whispers returned, louder now, almost mocking. This time, they weren't just in my head. As I ran through the labyrinthine corridors, the whispers coalesced into words, though their meaning was unclear. They spoke in overlapping tones, like 1,000 voices layered over one another. "Stay. Witness. Learn." I ignored them, my focus solely on the front entrance. If I could just get outside, I could leave this nightmare behind. But when I reached the lobby, the doors were gone. In their place was a wall of seamless glass, stretching from floor to ceiling. Beyond it, the city was visible, tauntingly close, but completely unreachable. I pounded on the glass, shouting for help, but the world outside didn't seem to notice me. Behind me, the growl returned, louder and closer. I turned to face it. The figure standing in the middle of the lobby wasn't Wells, but it wore his face or something like it. Its features were stretched and distorted, as if someone had tried to sculpt a human likeness out of wax and left it too close to the heat. "You broke the rules," it said, its voice layered with something inhuman. I didn't. I started to argue, but the thing interrupted me. "The rules are not suggestions," it snarled. "They are the only thing keeping this place contained, the binder." My eyes darted to the counter where I had left it, but the binder was gone. "You're supposed to follow them," the thing said, stepping closer. Its movements were jerky and natural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. I backed away, my heart hammering. Why does this place need rules? What is this museum? It didn't answer. Instead, it pointed to the East Wing. "See for yourself." I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me to run, to fight, to do anything but obey. But there was no escape. The doors were gone, and the creature blocked my path. So, with shaky legs and a pounding heart, I made my way down the corridor. The East Wing was different now. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, like they were alive. The whispers guided me, their tone shifting to something almost inviting. At the end of the corridor was a door I hadn't seen before. It was massive, made of dark wood, and adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift under my gaze. I opened it. Inside was a gallery unlike any other in the museum. The walls were lined with portraits, hundreds of them, each one more lifelike than the last. But these weren't just paintings. I recognized their faces. Wells was there, his expression frozen in an eternal scream. Next to him were others' faces I didn't know, but who shared the same haunting look of terror. Each portrait seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were breathing. At the center of the room stood an easel, its canvas blank, waiting. The creature appeared behind me, its distorted face hovering just over my shoulder. "This is your exhibit," it whispered. I turned to run, but the room was gone. The museum was gone. Everything around me had faded into an infinite void, and the easel was the only thing that remained. My feet moved against my will, carrying me toward it. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please no," but the void didn't care. The creature handed me a paintbrush, its bristles already wet with a dark, viscous liquid. "Paint," it commanded. I resisted, every muscle in my body screaming against the motion. But my hand betrayed me, moving on its own. The brush touched the canvas, and I began to paint. Each stroke felt like a piece of my soul being ripped away. The canvas filled quickly, the image taking shape without my input. It was me, trapped. When the painting was finished, the void collapsed. I was back in the museum, standing in the center of the East Wing. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as the next night shift employee walked into the gallery, their face a mixture of boredom and curiosity. The cycle had begun again.